Trululu, I'm recording, and you you go ahead.
You need to clap?
I have to clap?
No, you don't have to, but it's a tradition.
It is a tradition, yeah, okay. Twice.
Twice, eh? Twice. That's how we clap when we're cold. All right.
Hello.
Hello. Yeah, who's gonna do it?
I just said you had to do it.
But you said hello. I was gonna do it.
Bueno, dale.
Okay. Wait. Hello everyone, welcome to a new episode of From the North. As always, this is your boy Eduardo from Toronto, and we have here our second half of the podcast, Hermania from New York. I'm terrible at this, I'm sorry.
No, you're great. Such a video star.
Yeah, it's been 2 weeks. We wanted to do an episode last week, but shit happens. So we're just gonna do it this week, as usual, as per schedule. Many things have happened since the last time we had an episode. Mainly what's been in everyone's mind lately, at least on the internet, at least on the geopolitical side of the internet, which is where we're trying to be most of the time. It has been the election in Brazil. Bolsonaro has been ousted, and Lula da Silva is back in power, back as president of Brazil. Here, how are we feeling with that?
Well, I haven't seen first worlders this happy since I don't know when. I think since they were praising Chavez about 15 years ago. We Venezuelans will never be happy with an election outcome in Latin America, will be. And again, do I have to say it to our viewers? I also don't support Bolsonaro, but to me, this was Trump versus Bernie. And it's such a shame that the first world continues to praise these leftists from these countries that they see as underdeveloped and filled with noble savages that need a savior. Apparently, Edu, now the Amazon is saved. Thank God, right?
Oh yeah, that's what they say. I think that's the main reason why people outside of Brazil, outside of Latin America, were so supportive of Lula, because we're not gonna bullshit you. Bolsonaro was terrible for the Amazon, way worse than the previous governments. Not that Lula necessarily is gonna be any better. He's promised to be better. We're gonna see how we go with that. But what's interesting to me regarding this particular election is that usually when you have these situations where people are making assessments of what's going on in Latin America and which political outcome is best for a given country, and by people I mean people outside of Latin America, even though they're usually wrong, like they were with Bolivia, for example, like their assessment of Colombia, which we're gonna get to in a minute as well. But in this particular case, it's not so nuanced. If you Google Lula, and you Google Petrobras, which is the oil company of Brazil, or if you Google Lula plus Odebrecht, which is a construction company based out of Brazil, you're gonna find what's no secret to anyone, the biggest corruption scandal in the history of the American continent.
Well, sadly, that's a huge secret to most of the international audience, it appears. And the ones that do know about it think that it was just political persecution from previous governments.
But it wasn't. It was like a proven very awful corruption scandal on a mass scale that not only involved the head of state of Brazil, the previous heads of state, both Lula da Silva and Dilma Rousseff, but it also involved 11 countries of Latin America that were involved in this corruption scandal, I guess. Money laundering, stealing millions, probably billions of dollars, obviously secrecy, harassment by the people who were involved towards the police, towards people who knew about it so they wouldn't speak up. And this is no secret. Like, if you don't know what we're talking about, I invite you to Google it because this has been very well registered. Unfortunately, when the courts of Brazil were taking a look at this, at that time, I think Bolsonaro was in power when this like thing started, and they tried to rush it. They obviously some corruption on Bolsonaro's side to like try to make it even worse than it already was. To make sure that charges were pressed against Lula and that he would have run again in 2018, and eventually Lula was in prison for, I believe, close to 2 years. But he did come out of prison because, as a martyr, of course, not because he was proven to be innocent or anything like that. It's because the whole event, I guess, with the judges and so on, was considered to be mistrial because of all the things that already discussed, Bolsonaro pressing, also corruption on that side to get even worse charges. But the only reason why Lula is free today, it's not because he's innocent, it's because he had a mistrial. And this is something, as my understanding, that it's not closed yet and it could come
Well,
back.
it is now, baby. It is
Well,
now.
it could be. Might as well be. He's already president.
But it's
Trusting in the-
interesting that you mentioned that it wasn't just a corruption scheme in Brazil. It involved a lot of other Latin American nations, because I know we Venezuelans are annoying when we point out the leaders from other countries who have supported not only our dictator, but Fidel Castro and Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. But we do so because it's more grave than just, as grave as it is, respected world leaders expressing support for dictators. It's more than that. They work together towards corruption, towards criminality, towards helping each other stay in power, and that's what happened here.
Yeah, and a lot of this corruption happened like back home in Venezuela. I remember, if I know that a lot of our viewers are from Venezuela. If you've ever been to Caracas, if you've ever been to Las Mercedes, there's a huge hole in the ground that was supposed to be a subway station. Guess who was building it? It was Odebrecht, which was the company that was involved in this corruption scandal. And as it usually happens with these companies that are just set up for money laundering, it was never completed, and there's still a huge hole in the ground there. And with that, hundreds of public infrastructure projects all across Latin America, some of which were concluded, a lot of them which weren't. And the reason behind it is because they were used mainly as a means to like steal public money from people from Brazil, but also people from like different countries all across Latin America. So for me, it's insane that, again, like I said before, there's usually some nuance, and nuance is very hard to get when you're already biased. Bolsonaro has been a terrible political figure for everyone in Brazil or outside of Brazil. As we said many times here before, Bolsonaro was a terrible leader, very authoritarian in some regards. Some will call him far right. He was definitely terrible for the climate. He was also corrupt, but Lula is not that much better. And this particular election in Brazil, for me, it's the culmination of populism taking both sides of the aisle to the extreme. I can't think of an election that was as contended between two horrible figures like what we just saw in Brazil happening. And I'm afraid this will continue to happen as populism keeps growing, both in the left and the right. We're going to see more of these elections. And who knows, it might not stay just in Latin America. We might see it in the United States in a few years if the Democrats don't get their act together and Donald Trump becomes the next presidential candidate.
I mean, we just saw it in Colombia, and which, by the way, that was another election where Venezuelans were annoying everyone, like, hey, this guy supported our dictator. And in fact, Petro has, from the start, showed us that he indeed intends to follow the manual of Hugo Chavez and company. But I wanted to bring something up because I love pointing out the progressive bias in the developed, westernized, democratic world. I don't know if you noticed, but Well, for a while back, not just because of the elections, but Bolsonaro has become, just like Lula, a internationally recognized figure, which doesn't happen with every, Latin American leader. It's not a given. Like, as we always talk about in this show, usually Latin America is ignored. But I think Bolsonaro, because he's a character that's a lot like Trump, that's how they were selling him here. The Brazilian Trump. He likes to pick fights with American celebrities, and he has really adopted that kind of populism. It's been easy for liberal media in the first world to paint him as a Trump-like figure. Which he was. Together with the issue with the Amazon, that it's a cause that really can speak to like the progressive audience. The world was super paying attention to this election. And, as I said before, praying for Lula. We saw Ilhan Omar crying that Lula won. Jeremy Corbyn, of course, saying that the world is now saved. But what I found interesting was that the media was saying that Bolsonaro was not going to recognize his laws. They were really, it seemed, when he just spoke, by the way, he followed the Trump manual all the way till the end, because he kind of has dealt with his loss in a similar manner. I guess not as bad, because we haven't seen an attempted coup yet, the way it happened here. But he hasn't really admitted defeat, but said he will allow the transition to happen. I understand that's what's going on. And I thought, damn, American media is going to be pissed, because they were waiting for Bolsonaro to do something. And here's the hypocrisy part. Petro in Colombia did the same thing. He was setting the stage for weeks. This is going to be fraud. If we don't win, it's because the CIA did it, or whoever the hell lefties these days are blaming for their defeats. But the media didn't care about that. And
no
indeed,
one paid attention.
No one cared for some reason. Indeed, Petro ended up winning. So I don't know what happened with all the accusations of fraud he said was already happening. But yeah, these are the things I noticed. And sometimes I wish I did it, but they piss me off.
We still, as we're recording this episode, it is not very clear what the position of Bolsonaro is going to be. I don't think he has come out in public to actually...
No, he spoke.
He did?
He spoke today, and he said what I told you. He said he didn't...
That he was going to... Yeah. But he was going to assure a peaceful transition of power, but not necessarily recognizing...
No, exactly. He hasn't congratulated Lula or anything, or said I lost. But then what I understand is that he didn't even say it. Then his chief of staff came in and said the transition will start.
Well, let's see what happens in there. Maybe by the time this episode gets uploaded, shit hits the fan.
Oh my God. I will bet that it's not. Why?
Hopefully not. Hopefully
it's
not.
They want it to happen to fit the narrative.
Of course. But even if it doesn't fit the narrative, it doesn't matter. They're gonna keep doing this. Remember, they did this in Bolivia. The Bolivia situation, which I keep referencing today, it was a lot more nuanced, right? But remember, they're still talking about this, what happened in Bolivia, as a US backed coup and so on and so forth. But the one who gave the peaceful transition of power in Bolivia was Janine Áñez, who's currently today it's in jail.
We have to do an episode on that. And no one is paying attention to that either. I mean, she's still in jail, right?
She is in jail. She's a political prisoner, and people don't talk about that. People don't talk about the whole reason why people in Bolivia ousted Evo in the first place, which was the whole constitutional shebang that he was trying to pull off. And what happened with the elections, that they were very sketchy. So again, those things get lost in the nuance because it doesn't favor one particular narrative. It's clear as day that there is a bias, at least in the foreign, what we call the big press. Not gonna drop names, but you can figure out who they are. God, I sound like Ben Shapiro now. But there is a bias towards in favor of leftist candidates.
Well, Edwin, the other thing we have to point out in this line is why the Amazon is not indeed safe after Lula. It's because there are other countries that also have an Amazon, including Venezuela, who's doing things like Bolsonaro never did to the Amazon, but no one cares about that.
And no one pays attention to that. So, for people who may not know, the Amazon, yes, it's mostly in Brazil, but it's also in Venezuela, and it's also in Colombia, and it's also in this part of like North South America, if we should say it, and a government that's like actively working to destroy the Amazon to get profit out of minerals that they're giving to the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians and gold and all of these other stuff. It's the government of Venezuela. And again, this is very well documented. Like, it's not hard to miss. You just have to look for it. But you're never gonna hear this talking point about what's happening
That's
in
right.
Venezuela the way that's being talked about.
I think it's interesting what you're saying. It's not for lack of documentation, because there are great people doing this. It's for lack of attention,
exposure,
and exposure. Yeah. Correct.
Yeah.
I mean, Leonardo DiCaprio was tweeting about the Brazilian elections. I mean, has someone told him about Venezuela? Does he know?
Do you think Mark Hamill, who is like crying as well because Lula won, do you think Mark Hamill's know where
What about
Venezuela
the Avengers?
is?
The Avengers sent out a message for Lula to win.
The freaking Avengers. The Hulk, he's like a very radical leftist.
Mark
do you think
Ruffalo.
He knows where Venezuela is on a map? Or what do you think he would say if you asked him about the destruction of the Amazon in Venezuela? He probably doesn't know. It's willful ignorance. And it's because it's not really... Although they want to picture it as a matter of environmentalism, if it was truth environmentalism, you would be calling out shit that's also happening in different countries. But if you're just targeting Brazil, you're coming from somewhere. You're coming from maybe a political stance. Maybe you don't like Bolsonaro because you read in the media that Bolsonaro was like Trump. Again,
triggered the two names.
Yeah, but again, he was. But that just shows, at least to us who are informed as to what's going on in Venezuela in terms of the eco-catastrophe that's going on right now, the fact that no one really talks about it and they just let it happen, it tells me that they don't really care about the Amazon. They just care about politics. They just care about the right not winning. And this is not what this is about. We just did an episode in like environmentalism and the importance of nuclear energy. Now we're going to have to talk about the Amazon and the fact that the Amazon is being destroyed, not only by the Brazilian government, but by pretty much every government that sits on the Amazon. But they only care when the one doing it, it's someone that looks like Trump. So this is all bullshit. And speaking of things that we're talking about in Latin America, Petro today, it's in Caracas having lunch with Nicolás Maduro.
Oh my God, I actually didn't know that.
You didn't know that?
Did you save this? I don't know. I haven't seen this today. I've been like sick and I did it. Is this his first trip as president? I haven't. It mustn't be.
I would say that it is. Don't take that with a grain of salt. Like I haven't fact checked this. But it's one of his first trips as a president for sure, if not the first.
And that's a statement. That's a statement. And we knew this.
Maduro was isolated from the rest of the world since 2019, since all the things that happened with the repression of the protests, with the interim government, with the U.S. and then the rest of American states, and then the
and
European
it had
Union.
the neighbors against him. We now have to realize, whatever you want to say about Bolsonaro, like several things can be true at the same time. But he was an enemy to Maduro, so we had Bolsonaro and Duque have now been replaced by very friendly governments to Maduro. So
yeah, and like to the point, Petro is having lunch today with Maduro. So like this is. I hate that we're right. I want to be wrong. When we predicted that this was going to happen with Petro, a lot of people would say, oh, no, Petro wouldn't do that because Petro is different. No, here it is, Petro having lunch with Maduro in Caracas.
The level of harassment that I received for simply saying I was concerned about this election when he won was unparalleled to anything else. So it's quite interesting, and it makes perfect sense because you saw all the apparatuses of always when you speak against the authoritarians activate, and that's a good sign of what's to come.
Exactly. Like, you could have seen this coming from a mile away, and here it is. And I expect this to continue to happen with Lula as Lula takes power. She's gonna be very tight with Maduro, and we're back to square one. Maduro is as stronger as it's ever been, And this is not only something that's going to affect Venezuela, this is going to affect Nicaragua. We're probably going to see this kind of same normalizing of relationships between governments like Colombia, like Brazil, with the Nicaraguan dictatorship, and who knows, maybe even the Cuban dictatorship. It wouldn't be beyond them. They've done it in the past.
They all come
So
from El Foro de Sao Paulo, the Sao Paulo Forum. That's where this project of 21st century socialism started, and Lula was right at the head of that. So for anyone to say, people have told me he's not a far leftist. I mean, all I gotta say is El Foro de Sao Paulo.
of course, like, and if you look at the political map of Latin America, you miss a lot of nuance, probably in most of them. But the big picture is that South America, it's back to red. It's back to the left. And
How can it be? Like, this is, I told Edu, this episode just has to be about, like, fucking Latin America always going back to the same leaders and systems that over and over again have held us back.
And
all of these leaders, Edu, in Argentina, it's Peronismo. It's a system that they know. Like, Petro comes from las guerrillas, las paramilitares. Like, they know that. And still these countries are electing this. Lula again.
But that also speaks to a bigger issue, which is the failure of the alternative to actually be good at what they're doing. If they're not straight up radical populists on the other side of the aisle, like Bolsonaro was, they're just going to be incompetent at most, like Duque was. So this is just a cycle. As long as institutions hold strong in Latin America, what we're probably going to see in 4 or 5 years is that it's just going to turn back blue, and they're just going to vote for far right people, like they always do. Look at the numbers of approval for these leftist presidents that have been elected. As soon as they get elected, in 2-3 months, they're already like below 30%, below 20%. It's happening to Boric. It's happening to Petro. It's probably going to happen to Lula. And in a few years, we're going to see that going back. But that's the absolute state of Latin American politics. People are not satisfied with any government because they're all corrupt, because they're all terrible, and they just keep voting from one extreme to the other every 4 years. And that holds progress, because when you have people that are populist, that are antagonizing the opposition, you're never going to see real progress. You're going to see people accumulating more and more power.
Right. Just look at, the Argentinian economy is always such a good example for that, because they go to Peronismo, they regret it, they try to go a little more open market, but they don't resist, the pains of that switch from one system to the other, and then the cycle starts all over again.
And on that line, if there's a silver lining of all of this, is that most likely, I don't know when it's happening, but I know that it's relatively soon. In Argentina, they're going to hold elections, and what's most likely to happen is that Peronismo is going to be out of power.
Wait, already? Presidential elections?
I think so, yeah. I'm not sure how close it is. I don't think it's this year, but I know that it's soon enough.
I just realized, we've been talking about Lula back in power after all that corruption. Cristina is vice president of Argentina. I mean, I don't even think she hides it anymore.
Cristina Kirchner, the vice president of Argentina, probably also one of the most corrupt person to have ever hold a position of power. Allegedly, she also planned a couple political assassinations while she was in power, and she's there as vice president, and her popularity is tanking. So is Alberto Fernandez. So, it's a mess. Latin America is a mess, as it usually is. But what are we going to do about it? No one wants to listen. They only want to listen to, Bolsonaro lost? Yeah, that's good. He was like Trump, right? That's good. He lost. Let's go, Lula, whoever you are. Let's not Google you. I don't want to destroy my little fantasy that I built up in my head.
Right, but especially now, as we talked about, that Maduro is going to be stronger than he's been recently because of things are just aligning for him. And we continue to see something we have been talking about on this show that's really painful for us, which is Venezuelan migrants at the U.S.-Mexico border, as well as Nicaraguans, Cubans. I mean, this has been extremely documented in recent months. The numbers of the migrants from these countries are record highs. So it's interesting, you know, a lot of people are trying to sell that the situation in Venezuela has improved. However, these numbers speak for themselves. I saw Edu a video particularly. I don't know what it was taken. I heard it was a protest, but I'm seeing the visuals of the flag of
El Paso.
Venezuela at the board. Ugh, and it's so painful. What do you know if that was a protest or what it was? But people were saying that the border patrol guards were attacking the migrants in some way. Some people were saying firing rubber bullets, but I read that that wasn't the case. I'm not sure.
So I'm not sure if it was a protest, but what it was is a number, important number of migrants, mostly from Venezuela, that were trying to, I don't know, get close enough to the U.S. border, and they were pushed back by the authorities. And that also is something that I wanted to talk about today, because that is something that it's also not talked about enough, I think. Um, I've seen a lot of this information on the internet about what it means to be a refugee and the rights that people have as refugee claimants, as prospective refugees. A lot of people say, you can't simply just walk into another country and seek asylum, but I'm sorry to tell you, but that's exactly what the international law stipulates. You are allowed to do that. It is your right as human in this world to at least have your asylum case heard, considered, and then have a final decision. If that decision is negative, then that government is within all of their right to turn you back or send you to a different country. But at least they have to hear your pledge. And what's happening in the US border, it's a consequence of a continuation of a very specific emergency type policy that Donald Trump enacted, Title 42, which allowed the US government to bypass that whole listening to the asylum case first before turning migrants back because of COVID, which I never supported, but at least I can somewhat understand where it's coming from. But Biden got into the White House promising to be more humane when it came to migration. And that policy, that Title 42, it's still there, even though COVID's pretty much over. And I will say it's over. There's no reason to keep using Title 42 to turn migrants back. But it just seems that they're not going to take it away just so they can keep pushing migrants back to the south of the border. So this is a violation of international human rights. This is inhumane. These are people that both sides of the aisle in the U.S., in Washington, both the Republicans and the Democrats, they love to use Venezuela as a talking point, talking about how bad the Venezuelan dictatorship is, which it is, how terrible the situation in Venezuela is, which it is. But when you have people that are coming to your door asking for a second chance, asking for a better life for themselves and their families, you just turn them back.
Even though both sides have accepted that these countries are going through something, even if both sides, you know, have different reasons for it, these migrants are not convenient for either side. The right doesn't want to let migrants in at all. And the left doesn't want to really focus too much on the reason these migrants are fleeing these countries. So what we have is no one paying attention to them. I can assure you, if you had thousands and thousands of Brazilians fleeing Bolsonaro every day, we would be seeing that angle more in the news. So what's happening at the border is unforgivable. And Elu, I know people who watch this show have been asking me to speak about this because you and I both stood against Trump, particularly because we thought his rhetoric about migrants was not the right way to go for the leader of the free world. But which it wasn't, but the treatment of the Biden administration to these migrants is also not what we want to be seen. And I'm also a bit confused, Elu, because as it happens usually with these issues, people take it and see whatever they want because the right says Biden has an open border and there's no law and order. And then we are seeing that that's not the case at all. So it's like everyone lives in their own universe according to what their ideologies are.
And who are the real victims? The people that are being turned back and they're being sent back to Mexico and probably to even back to Venezuela in some cases.
By the way, Ayo, I have to say, like, I've talked to a lot of the migrants that cross the U.S.-Mexico border. I have gone to visit them in immigration jails. A lot of these migrants are girls who made this trek alone, who have told me that they literally walk from Venezuela to the US Mexico border. And a lot of them told me that the most dangerous and scariest part of the journey for them was having to stay in certain areas of Mexico that are overtaken by narcos and gangs, and for these women and anyone to have to be turned back to that situation when they were just trying to make it enough time to get to the US. Like, I just got like my skin just froze because it's horrible.
Yeah, it's also anecdotal, but I have a friend who recently also, you know, came into the north to become a refugee, and in the process he met people from Venezuela and from Colombia who made that who traveled all across. Some of them traveled from the Darien in Panama all the way to Mexico and into the US. And for all of them, the worst part of it was Mexico, especially when you're getting close to the border because of that, because it's controlled by cartels, it's controlled by coyotes. And these are criminal gangs that are taking advantage of people that are vulnerable and that they literally had nothing on them other than the money that they were able to save to make the trip. And these people that my friend talked to, they got stolen thousands of dollars that they were going to use to start their lives here in North America. It's a tragedy. They are the real victims, and because of political talking points, this is not being addressed. And what's like, I don't think we have to like go back to what we think about the Republican Party and Trump and their migration policies, because they are absolutely terrible, and we've been through this already. But the one who's sitting on the White House right now is Joe Biden. The one that controls the Congress and the Senate are the Democrats. They have pretty much power to make things happen, and they are allowing a Trump era policy to be used to violate human rights of prospective refugees and deny them of their right to have their asylum claims heard. So this is
Also,
something
Edu,
that
these are
pisses me
countries
off.
that this administration has sanctioned. So, as we have always said in this show, yes, sanction these regimes, but you better accept the migrants when they show up at your door, too.
Or at the very least, you try to do something to make the situation change. You're only sanctioned in Venezuela. You're not doing anything else about it. These sanctions are not being effective against the Venezuelan government. What's causing this, the sanctions are just adding up to the hundreds and the thousands of issues that countries like Venezuela and Nicaragua already have. And when the migrants show up at your border, you're gonna send them back. So what the fuck are you doing for these people? Nothing. You don't care about Venezuela or Nicaragua.
So,
You're
on
just
that,
using them as talking
Edu,
points.
this is the right time and we have to talk about it. And I actually don't know why we haven't talked about it, because we don't care about touching these issues. The Biden administration seems to be trying out new things with the situation in Venezuela. We know that the interim government of Guaido is a joke. He's no president of anything. However, the US has continued to recognize him because it's not as easy after they got 50 countries or whatever to support this guy to just remove it. Plus, the National Assembly was the last democratically elected body of government in Venezuela. Los Sobrinos, the Joe Biden administration exchanged, I think it was six Go Venezuelan American executives who have been 6 or 8, I don't remember the exact number, had been imprisoned in Venezuela for years and years. They exchanged them for 2 nephews of the Venezuelan first lady who had been convicted of massive drug trafficking. What do you think of?
I think it's bullshit. I think it's insane that that's the position that the government is taking. I think that the interim government it's no longer a thing. So the little recognition that we had as I guess for the democracy cause, it's pretty much gone. I'm just disappointed, I guess. I was hoping for governments around the world to be better, especially the government of the United States to be better about the situation of Venezuela, but they pretty much played their cards in 2019, didn't work out, they gave up. And now they need oil. So now they need to be in good terms with Venezuela.
Right, that's another thing that's been happening simultaneously. Rumors and rumors that the sanctions will be tweaked when it comes to the oil industry. So there are changes coming. Also, it seems members of the interim government have kind of like slowly stopped calling themselves diplomats or whatever fake position they've been having for the last 2 years. The Biden administration, with this release of prisoners, is showing its willingness to negotiate. Of course, they did get something back, but as we always say in this show, it's a revolving door. Yes, they freed 6 Venezuelan Americans. They will get 10 tomorrow. That's just how it works. I am happy for these families. Ew, one of the girls I know very well. I mean, she doesn't care about any of the things we talk about, you know. She just wanted her dad home, and I can understand that. However, there is more to these issues that, you know, involves millions of people, and that's how politics works. And something is coming with Venezuela. We're going to see another negotiation. There are local elections in Venezuela. I haven't even looked at that, but it seems that Venezuelan politicians like freaking Enrique Capriles is really gonna run for press. Like, I can't even say it. I can't even say it seriously.
Yeah, no, there's going to be elections in Venezuela because the opposition has pretty much just gave up. They just assumed that they want to play their part in the government of Nicolas Maduro. Obviously, Chavismo loves it. It's they're being legitimized by the opposition.
This is what they need after they were declared a dictatorship by the world. As we have said on this show, this is their one goal, for the world to say Maduro is the legitimate president of Venezuela. This is not a dictatorship.
And that's another thing that I can't believe it needs to be brought up. Like, I can't believe you need to educate people about this. But democracy is way more than an election. An election is the culmination of democracy. But all the things that come before an election, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of political activity.
And after, even if you're elected, you break the Constitution a year later, that's also not democratic.
An election by itself, it doesn't mean democracy. And that's why, yes, you have elections in China, you have elections in North Korea, you have elections in Cuba, you have elections in Venezuela.
Xi Jinping just got reelected. Did you see how happy Evo was? Oh my god, Evo doesn't even hide it. Evo was like celebrating so hard on Twitter.
But you know what's funny about Evo though is that he, like, politically and his party, but more so himself, very tied with this leftist governments and dictatorships and whatnot. But economically, they're selling to everyone. They sell to the Chinese, they sell to the Americans, they sell to the Europeans. Actually, Bolivia is not in a terrible economic situation right now because they're mining their resources, you know, even though they're supposed to be.
Yeah, what's up with that? Do the first world leftists know this?
They don't. They drive the Teslas that are built with, you know, what's being extracted from Bolivia.
That Elon Musk is not stealing it. Like, it's being sold.
It's being sold. And it's also, you know, probably obviously not as bad as, for example, what's happening in the Amazon in Venezuela or what's happening in Brazil. But, you know, there's also some destruction of the environment when you have to mine resources, to, especially with the demand for the resources that pretty much only Bolivia has for electric cars, for electric vehicles to be built. They're doing pretty good. So, you know, if I had to say a good thing about Bolivia and their government, is that they know how to play the world. They can be, in the terms of foreign policy, they can be as anti-imperialist as they want, but when it comes to money, they will sell to every empire. The Chinese, take it. The Russians, take it. The Americans, take it. I don't give a crap.
Hey, that's Maduro too, to be fair. As I always say, like, who do you think financed Chavismo? The US. like not so, like, up until 2017, 2018, around there, 50% of the oil that Venezuela was selling was going to the United States of America. All throughout Chavez's presidency, the anti-Yankee, the guy who went to the UN and did that whole show where he, you know, how funny,
he did this, and he's so funny, and oh my god, he's different, he's a great socialist.
Different.
nah, like this guy was selling oil to the Americans, and it used that revenue to increase his power, to become more authoritarian, to destroy Venezuelan democracy, and to become a dictator that by the time that he died, for every measure, he pretty much was.
And that reminds me, it was something I wanted to mention about those images that brought both you and I down of the Venezuelan flag at the border. Because as we were discussing, all the different layers of what those images mean, for us, like I live in the US, it it makes, in one part I have feelings about it as someone who voted for Joe Biden, and then other parts I have feelings about it for just humanity, like what are these people going through. Then another part of that is, again, the unhealed scab and like wound of exile, because when I was seeing that flag, I had like a flashback of like times when I perceived my country as successful and as a good place to be, like, this is so silly, but like I was watching Luis Olavarrieta. He's a Venezuelan journalist, does a great job, and he does interviews of the beauty queens. So he has like a docu series where he talks to all the Venezuelan Miss Universes, and they talk about like when they went to the pageant and how the country received them. I mean, it is ridiculous how much we cared about beauty pageants. Yes, we don't have to go through that. It is ridiculous.
Even problematic.
It's ridiculous. But what I mean is, we were a country. We had a place, a culture, we had wealth, we had something that does not exist anymore. And literally I saw it all in my head, like me sitting as a kid in my grandma's house watching Sao Sensacional, just like being around your culture, like those, like you can joke with anyone on the street about like the freaking beauty pageant and they'll get it. Like we will never have that again. And to me, visually, that's that picture of the flag at the border, is that feeling. I'll never have my country again.
We probably won't. That's something that I have accepted, even though I come here, we come here, and we talk about these things that matter to us because they still matter. But as it is right now, Venezuela has never been further from democracy as it is right now. Those images at the border really hit me also very hard. For me in particular, I just have my closet here. I just opened it, and I also have like a Venezuelan flag. This is the flag that I used at the protests when I like was back home. It's funny that I don't know if it's funny or messed up, but it even has some of my blood in there from the repression and the protest. And seeing that flag, seeing someone bearing the flag, and being pushed back and apparently allegedly being shot rubber bullets by a police body, really brought me back to my time in Caracas and when that was happening to me. But seeing it, that it wasn't the Venezuelan authorities who were doing that now, it was the border authorities in the United States of America doing that now. It just reminded me that we're not wanted. We're not wanted. It seems like we're not wanted anywhere in the world. We're not wanted in a lot of countries in South America. Most of them have shut their borders down for migrants and refugees.
Started asking for visas for Venezuelans in countries like Mexico.
Start asking for visas that are not only a bureaucratic hassle that people have to go through, but most of these, the reason why people ask for governments ask for visa is because that would give them the authority to unilaterally deny most of them, which is what's going to happen, which is what's happening. And the saddest part of all this is that not only are we hated as migrants, as refugees, by people from other countries that have been sold the idea by politicians, as politicians often do, that the reason why their countries are having issues is not because of corruption or their own internal problems, but because of Venezuelans, because we're just guinea pigs at this point. But also seeing the reaction of fellow Venezuelans to that video of Venezuelans trying to, like, I don't know, get close to the border, whatever they were trying to do, and like being happy about it, Many of these people who were making these awful comments about their fellow Venezuelans were themselves migrants once, if not, if there still are. Some of them are even refugees. I know that they're refugees because I know them personally. Um, and that the conclusion that I reached there is that not only other nationalities and people from other nationalities hate us, but we also hate ourselves. Um, so my message here is, I don't want to end it on a gloomy note, but I guess my message here is that this is why we got to stick together as a culture, as people. This is why we need to combat this when we see it from our fellow Venezuelans discriminated against other Venezuelans just because they came later than they did, just because they perceive them to be poor, because they perceive them to be criminals. We need to stick together because our country has already perished. I don't know when we're gonna get it back, but all of us here who are outside of Venezuela and those who are still back home, we need to stick together because a country is not made by a border, it's not made by a government, it's made by its people. And if we're not sticking together, that's when our country is definitely going to die. So let's stick together, and for the good of Venezuela, and I don't know, to feel better. Thanks for coming to another episode of From the North. Hey, we're all happy here.
No, I think that was so beautiful, Edu. Truly, that comparison of you being assaulted by regime forces in Venezuela with your flag and then see it at the US-Mexico border, that should be a poem, truly. And you know what I was thinking? Like, how many of those Venezuelans who are now not standing alongside their fellow countrymen, who are now migrants, how many of those people also didn't stand by the early protesters of Chavez, for example? I remember when people, like, I come from a family that started fighting this regime from day one, and people would say, why are you doing that? But, like, I remember my mom was a journalist. People would be like, ¿por qué tú te estás buscando lo que no se te ha perdido? Like, why are you gonna get in that trouble? Like, he's just another corrupt president. He'll come and go. And a lot of people didn't want to speak up. So there you go. That's what I have to say about that. And yeah, this was a gloomy episode from the North because Latin America continues to disappoint us, but we still love her because we are toxic, I guess. So see you next time.
It's our most toxic relationship. Take it easy, guys. Bye.